ado, I'm going to introduce Ashley, and then she'll introduce Kelly, and we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Gonzalez. I'm a partner here at Brewer Alford and Pedersen. A lot of you have probably seen me before. I see some familiar faces. Hi, Mark. How's it going? I'm back here today to give you another class. I also brought my colleague, Kelly Sorensen. I'll let her introduce herself. But first, for me, I've been at the Brewer firm for almost 7 years now, and I've practiced exclusively real estate law. My sweet spot are, things like partition cases, landlord-tenant law. We've done a little bit of this lot split area. It's so new, so there aren't a ton of lawsuits and things like that. But a lot of leasing, and also I do non-disclosure lawsuits as well, both representing brokers and agents and buyers and sellers. So Kelly, I'll let you give your intro.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kelly Sorensen. I've been at Brewer for about a year now. I've been practicing in real estate litigation for about two and a half. And prior to that, I worked in personal injury. My husband and I recently moved up here from LA. Actually, it was January of last year. So I'm really loving getting to know the Bay Area better and meeting so many wonderful people like you. So we're excited to get going on this presentation.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen so you all can see my PowerPoint as we go. So let me pop that up. Okay, let's see. All right, so SB9 and 10, that's what you all are here for. We're gonna give you an overview and divide and conquer the different areas, and hopefully give you a little bit more guidance on what these things mean, how you can use them, maybe some things you didn't know. And so we'll just jump right into it. Let me go. So first, disclaimer, I have to give this to you all. Every case is different, every set of facts is different. And so what we're providing today is not necessarily a perfect piece of advice for your specific situation. And so just take what we're saying with a grain of salt, and just know that every situation is different. And if you run and utilize the advice we're giving you today, it may not actually apply to your specific situation. So just be careful with that. First, SB9, and this is what a lot of people call the Home Act. And SB9 is split into two separate areas, or the two biggest changes, I like to call them. And that's the lot split provision and the duplex provision. However, I think it's a bit of a misconception when it comes to the duplex provision, because it's actually the Two Residential Units Act. So it's not necessarily a duplex provision, because you can actually do with that provision a detached additional residential unit. So the traditional duplex arrangement, it doesn't have to be that. So I don't want you to misconceive that and think that it's only a duplex that you can build. It's just two residential units. So that's important to know as well. Additional units via existing ADU laws. So not only can you split a lot or add an additional unit to an existing lot, you can also add ADUs or JADUs in addition to that. So you can really get the amount of units you have on each parcel up much higher than you could before. And if you've seen anything on the ADU laws, the existing ones, and how they've been passed over time, there's been a lot of changes and a lot of additions that pretty much allowed you to build an ADU almost in every situation, where previously they were able to restrict it. Now, they can put caps on certain things, but for the most part, you can almost always build one. It just has to be within the law, and setbacks have been changed drastically, but we'll talk a little bit about that. And then probably the biggest item that I think you all want to know about is how many units can you get on these lots. So I'm sure you've seen a lot online about you can have 8 units on what was previously a single lot. So with a lot split, and then with the duplex provision and the ADUs, you can get up to eight units. Now, that's not always the case, and I'll explain that. So I'll give you 3 scenarios that I think are helpful, that could help you understand what kind of things you can do and how many units you can get up to. So 3 scenarios. So say you just want to use the duplex provision. That's fine. So if you do that and you don't do a lot split, the most you can do is 4 units. So if you have a single family home, you can actually boost that lot without splitting the lot up to 4 units. And how you do that is you add a freestanding unit, or you convert the existing unit to a duplex, and then you can add an ADU and a JADU. Now, I don't want to get too far into those because it's very specific, just like SB9 and 10. But if you think about it, if you have a single family home and you have a big lot, right, which in some cases that's the norm, it just depends on the area, you can add either a detached additional residential unit. So it's not an ADU, it's a freestanding house or a townhouse, or you can add on to your existing home and make it a duplex. And you can also add in an ADU and a JADU. So that gets you to 4 units. That's one situation. The second one, if you just invoke the lot split provision and you don't do the duplex provision, you can do up to 6 units. And I'll explain how that happens. So if you have a single lot with a residential home and you split the lot, and then you add in another residential unit on the new lot, and then you add an ADU and a JADU on the second lot, and an ADU and a JADU on the prior lot. So it would give you a total of 6 units, and that, that may not fit your specific needs, but that would give you 6 in total. Now to the 8 unit situation, how do you get there? So you would invoke both the lot split provision and the duplex provision, similar as to the prior ones. And so then you would have 2 residential units on each lot. And then you would have an ADU and a JADU on each one, giving you 2 units. So you probably ask why is 8 units not always possible? Well, what happens is if you invoke the duplex provision and the lot split provision, cities do not have to automatically grant you the right to do an ADU. They don't have to do it. They can restrict that, where previously they can't prevent the building of an ADU or a JADU. They can do it if you invoke both provisions. So if you want to do both, it could actually limit you. So I thought that was pretty important. Next one, SB9, as we've been talking about so far, it takes the ADU laws a little bit further. And what do I mean by that? So one of the more recent bills that passed is AB 1584. What that law did was it made any covenant or restriction that effectively prohibits construction or use of ADUs void and unenforceable. However, restrictions which do not reasonably increase the cost of construction are okay. So while they can't prevent you from building it, they can insert certain restrictions as long as it just doesn't make it completely unfeasible for you to build. So that was one of the many ones passed. I'm sure you saw previous ones like SB 1069, AB 2299, 670, SB 13. The list goes on. There have been a ton of bills passed, and I think what I see coming down the pipeline is potentially that happening with SB 9 and 10 is as with the ADU laws, right? As things developed and things changed, they had to add subsequent bills because something wasn't workable or wasn't practical. And I think that in this situation, that could be the case. We may see 4, 5, 6, 7 bills down the road where little tweaks or little nuances in the law aren't workable, so they'll have to adjust those. And then let me go back to one of these. So the changes in the ADU laws where it's relevant in this area, SB 9 and 10, one of the key exceptions that the ADU laws provided are, number 1, the owner doesn't have to live in the primary residence to build an ADU on a lot. And so there are requirements with the lot split provision, duplex provision, where you have to live in one of the primary residences if you split the lot. However, if you do a lot split and you're living in this side, and previously what had to be the case was if you were to add an ADU, you had to live in the primary residence. So now what the bills did for the ADU laws is when you do a lot split and you build a primary residence, you can now build an ADU without having to live in the main home on the new lot. So I thought that was an important change. Also, agencies must approve applications for an ADU within 60 days, so they can't drag it out forever. And then they change certain requirements, both the setback requirements, now it's at 4 feet, where previously it was much larger. And then the minimum lot size requirements have been changed as well. And so, and one important thing I did want to note is that construction of an ADU is sometimes a good option for owners, not always. And if you've seen any of my talks before, you know that tenant laws in California are pretty aggressive, namely AB 1482 and all the subsequent bills from COVID and things like that. But essentially what an exemption in the just cause requirements or just cause protections, you should say, is that if it's a freestanding home on a lot, that its title is separate to any other dwelling unit, you're exempt from just cause as long as you serve certain notices of exemption. Now, if you go and add an ADU, you might take yourself out of that exemption. So you want to be careful before you start building units and start adding on these ADUs and JADUs, because where you were previously exempt from just cause, now that may be an issue for you because it's not susceptible to that exemption because there's an additional unit. So while you would get another tenant or you would have another unit to utilize, it may prevent you from evicting that tenant if you had to. So I thought that was pretty significant. And then also, if you do a lot split, this is something that is a bit foreign or undeveloped, I think, in the law, or at least that we've seen so far, is that if you do a lot split and you build an ADU on the new lot, that could be an issue because you can't technically, or at least the way the law is written now, you can't technically sell that new lot with just an ADU on it. You would have to have a primary residence as well, because technically the way they have written it is that you can't, an ADU is not a freestanding unit, it's an accessory dwelling unit. So you would have to figure out a way to convert that to a primary residence or a residential unit and then sell the lot. But if you're just doing an ADU and you've split the lot, that's going to be an issue if you want to sell that subsequent lot off to a buyer. Okay, now jumping to Kelly on this one, she's going to talk to you about some of the requirements for the lot split.
Yeah, so this, you can see right here that these are the requirements, or an overview at least of the requirements for the lot split provision. And a lot of it is, for the most part, pretty intuitive and it makes sense, but I think we should go through each of these and sort of discuss where you can implement SB9. So Ashley, would you go to the next slide?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so first of all, of course, the lot itself needs to be zoned as a single family residence. That's sort of intuitive, I think that makes sense. But then once the lot is split, then the split lots need to be equal in size, or at least 60-40. So then the lot that is created, the second lot, if you will, that is created from the original lot, cannot be any smaller than 40% of the original parcel size, and it has to be at least 1,200 square feet. Another really specific requirement is that the lot needs to be in this city or urban cluster. And again, that's sort of an intuitive definition, but we've got it here on screen of what that means. And really, if you keep in mind what the whole purpose of SB9 and SB10 is, it's to address this housing crisis that we have in California. And so it would be filling these areas where there is a higher density population and more of a need for additional housing and denser housing too. So again, the lot would need to be in a city or urban cluster. Can you go to the next slide, Ashley? Thank you. This is also intuitive, that it cannot be in a farmland or a historic property like a landmark area. That would make sense too, of course. Another important requirement is that an existing dwelling on a lot cannot be partially or even completely demolished. And so this would be housing that's subject to a covenant ordinance or a law that restricts rents, housing that is subject to rent control, also Section 8 type housing, any housing with a tenant for the last 3 years. So again, this is meant to help address or continue the purpose of SB9, which is to address the housing crisis. So if there is an existing dwelling on a lot, it cannot be demolished. But as Ashley's already explained, it can be built up. And we'll show you a graphic as an example in a couple of slides to show what you can use or what you can do with an existing lot or dwellings or units that are already on a lot. It cannot be the lot cannot be mass developed. And this again is meant to, I think, alleviate some concerns for homeowners in the areas of where these, where SB9 could be implemented, because what they don't want is to have these massive developers come in and put giant apartment buildings or something like that. And so it needs to not be a mass development. And that's why it's limited in how many units can be placed on these lots when they're split. This is a very big point too. There is a requirement that the owner has to live in at least one of the units for 3 years. And it's the owner putting forth a declaration that states, I intend to live here as my primary occupancy for 3 years. So that's a very, very big, important piece to this, that your clients would have to be aware of, that this is not just meant for renting out completely. They would have to live in one of these units on the lots. And then also it cannot have been withdrawn from the rental market, so it couldn't have been an Ellis Act removal or eviction of the lot. So I think those were the requirements. So I think Ashley would talk about the duplex provision.
Sure. And before I jump into that, Jody, do you want to ask some questions? It looks like we have a little bit of a build up.
I will. I'm going to start at the top here. Does hillside residential, number 1, count as a single family resident? Las Gatas passed an ordinance 2327 that prohibits SB9 against hillside residence zone, but there's a number of challenges. Wondering if you have an opinion.
I mean, my opinion generally would be that they would be able to pass that, although I know it's being challenged, but it's similar to, I think there's a couple instances. There's one down south, but most of you probably heard of this one in Woodside. You've heard about how they technically were able to prevent this, at least for now. I don't know if it's being challenged yet in the court. I haven't seen anything that you can't do it in certain areas because it's protected mountain lion land. And so if it's a historic property where they're able to designate it as an area where it has some kind of value that's not standard with like a tract home area, it's a specific, historical land, endangered species, that type of thing. I think that they'd be able to put a restriction, but this hillside one, I mean, if they're able to justify a basis for it, I could see a judge granting that, just because it seems like it does give discretion to the courts to allow that. I don't, that's not much of a legal answer, but it just sounded like you wanted my opinion on what might happen.
Let's see. What is farmland? Zoned ag or ag in master plan, but not being used as farmland?
I guess I'm not real clear on the question, so if you want to follow up on that. So it sounds like you're asking what is farmland, or if you're asking about zoning qualifications. I'm not too sure on how to answer that.
So Art, if you want to unmute yourself and ask, and then
Yeah.
Joseph after that. So Art, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question about farmland.
Yeah, sure. So what's the definition of farmland? Is that obviously if it was zoned agricultural, that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But if it's not zoned agricultural, but somehow in the master plan it shows as a parcel designated for agriculture.
Yeah.
I mean, what holds precedent? Oh, what holds more weight?
Are you referring to the master plan with maybe an HOA or not HOA, but restriction, like deed restrictions, or what? What
No,
master, where is that coming from?
it's in the city's master plan.
Oh, okay, yeah,
So they'll
yeah.
have each parcel designated for the plan for use. And if the
Mhm,
use
yeah.
was designated as agricultural, but the lot's not zoned agricultural, does that matter?
I don't think it matters. I think if it has a farmland designation, and my experience in this is pretty limited, but we actually have a trial coming up in this kind of case, but it's related to a partition. But I believe if it's designated as farmland, I think that's a subsection of the agricultural designation. And that I think what they're providing is pre-approval that if you did want to farm that specific parcel or areas, the zoning, parameters, that they are giving an indicator that they would approve it right there as far as accessibility, water access, irrigation, all of those things. I think it's more of a pre-designation that if you wanted to buy it and farm it, it's met their minimum requirements to do that. But I think if you were trying to split it, or as relates to this presentation, that I wouldn't know offhand. But I know that from my experience, it's based on they're telling you ahead of time. That way, if you're buying it, you don't have to kind of gamble whether or not it'll be allowed or not. From my understanding, they're telling you that it would be approved if you wanted to farm rice or corn, whatever it was.
But for the purpose of this ordinance, if it's not zoned agricultural, would it still be considered farmland?
I don't know offhand. I don't know if Kelly knows.
Yeah, I've been trying to find an appropriate definition for farmland while we've been discussing this, and I haven't come up with it yet, but once I'm able to find it, I can email it to you. And I think it was Art that was asking this question.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Art,
Yeah,
I can
thank you.
grab your email or after the lecture and send it to you.
Perfect.
Cool,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna do one more question, and then Mike, I see you raise your hand, but I'm gonna go to my chat questions that were next. And then you're fine. And then move on just so that we can keep things moving. I know there's gonna be a lot of questions. And Joseph, if you want to unmute yourself, just so that we understand what's wrong with ADU and the lot split. How do we make an ADU as a primary resident, either before or after the split?
Yeah, I think, right.
Okay.
Carrie was talking about that if you split it after you build an ADU, that may be a concern. My question is, I thought strategically that's what you wanted to do. You want to build an ADU because it's a quicker process, assuming you build it based on family standards such as a utility, including the sewage line. And when you split, I thought strategically that's what you wanted to do. That's the quickest way to become two single family. What is the definition? What do you qualify that ADU to become a primary resident?
Yeah, so what you would have to do is you'd have to get it signed off and ensure the ADU meets the minimum requirements for a residential unit, a freestanding residential unit. So
right.
Typically as built, in a lot of situations they could be, but I know there's additional requirements. So the issue is that if you split your lot and it leaves the ADU freestanding, then you need to get a building inspector out to either give you a punch list or to give you a sign off on having that approved as a freestanding unit, residential unit, because it would, in theory, it would no longer be an accessory dwelling unit. Yeah. So
you just need to satisfy building code as a primary resident, whatever that is. That was my question. I thought strategically that's what you wanted to do. Instead of splitting the lot to build a family, and that would take much longer and cost you a lot more to do that.
What I don't want though, Joseph, is that if you build the ADU, and then you split the lot, if there's any kind of situation where you cannot make it a freestanding unit, then you're stuck with a new lot with an ADU on it that you can't sell unless you build a primary residence. So my issue would be that I think it would be risky to build the ADU and just assume that you can get it signed off when I don't know if you've dealt a lot with planning departments, but certain cities and counties can really make it difficult. So I would not feel comfortable doing that unless you had some sureties that you could get it signed off.
Well, you're going to need to do the same thing if you were splitting and build a family, a single family, you will need to follow all the rules and regulation anyway. But I don't want to take too much time on that.
Oh, no,
We have
that's fine.
limited time.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah, thank you.
And we have more questions coming in, so I'll let you guys get along with your presentation. I promise
Okay.
you, I'm keeping order. And I know we're scheduled for an hour, but if you guys are
Yeah.
able to stay on after, we can keep going with questions. But we'll go and then we'll pause in a little bit.
Okay, that sounds good. Just to knock out one of them, I think Kevin asked if you build 2 main houses and 2 ADUs on a single lot, do they need to stay for 3 years? My understanding, Kevin, is the answer is no. It's when you do a lot split and you build an additional residential unit on the new lot, you have to live in one of those. I think that's only a requirement for the lot split, but Kelly can chime in if she disagrees, but I believe you only have to have that primary residence met if you do the lot split. So
Sorry, Ashley, I
Okay.
didn't mean to cut you off. That was my understanding as well, is that it's
Okay.
a requirement for the lot split provision, but not necessarily the duplex provision.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we'll move on and we'll answer the rest later.
Okay.
So the duplex provision, again, we've talked a little bit about this, but this is an independent and separate provision of SB9 that allows for the construction of a 2-unit building or 2 residential units on the same lot where it's previously, it's zoned single family. And so that, I think it's a big change to the law. And I think this presents the most issues and may be changed the most over time, in my opinion, is because if you have a lot that's been set up for 1 residential unit and you add another one, I think that's significantly different than building an ADU, similar to what Joseph was talking about. But I think that you would have a more difficult time, or it would require more work to ensure that the second, primary resident, or however you want to designate it or name it, the second residential unit, not an ADU, would need, I think, more concentration on access, utility services, things like that. And so it would obviously cost you more money, but I think it's a unique option, something you should utilize if it's appropriate. And the requirements are essentially the same as the lot split. It has to be single family zoning in the urban cluster. You can't demolish any affordable or rent controlled housing. Kelly mentioned that, but if you think about it, what AB 1482 did and 2038 or 2088 and additional ones, it pretty much made every residential property subject to rent control laws unless you're exempt. And so this covers a lot of housing when it comes to these provisions, is that you could, essentially what they're doing is you can't demolish any of the housing unless you actually meet the exemption requirements. So it could be significant, in my opinion. And then again, you can't demolish more than 25% of the existing structure unless you're granted an exception. Also, they talk about it being occupied by tenants in the last 3 years. So that's important too. If you do have an investment property where you want to add an additional, freestanding unit, or you want to convert your existing investment property to a duplex. And then another issue that I saw, I want to talk about briefly, is that conversion of ADU to a duplex residential unit. And Joseph, you asked about this. And things that can arise from this is the difference between that is, let me go through the list I was able to find in notes about the bill. There's issues with the ability to sell a lot with an ADU, as technically it's not a sellable lot if you split it and you only have the accessory dwelling unit. And it's usually better to build the additional unit as a duplex or an additional residential unit rather than an ADU or JADU, just for market purposes. I think it markets a lot better. And then if you did want to eventually do the lot split, you would have 2 freestanding lots with a single family home on it, and that's double the sale value compared to if you had an ADU. You couldn't really do a lot split to where you can have 2 existing units. You'd have to do a lot split and then build potentially another 2 units. So it could be significantly more costly than if you just do, where you utilize the duplex provision. And then even if you didn't do the lot split, or if you wanted to, you set yourself up for being able to have 2 sellable lots. Compared with the ADU, it may not be an option. Okay, and why is SB9 important? There's a ton of reasons, as we've talked about, but if you meet the requirements, they really have no room to deny your application. It's a ministerial approval process. It doesn't give them any discretion or judgment in approval or denial. So they really just tick through the information that you give them to make sure that you've met the minimum requirements. So as lawyers, we love that, because if we have a pretty bright line list of things that you have to do and we submit that, we would feel pretty certain telling you that, yeah, you're going to be approved for the split or for the duplex provision, because it's not up for discretion. We don't have to wait on someone to make a decision or give an opinion. It's just a matter of procedure. So I love that about the bill. And then again, it creates a new independently alienable sellable lot. So not only is that more valuable to the market, but it's also more valuable, in my opinion, for landlord tenant items, because as I mentioned, a single family property that doesn't have any other units on the lot is technically exempt from just cause. So that's, in my opinion, that's worth itself just by that provision. Again, new lot can potentially be improved with up to 4 units. And I talked about the 8-unit option a little bit. It just depends on where you are. If they want to approve all 8, they don't have to do it if you utilize both provisions. So just be careful with that. Again, more land and houses to sell means more volume, more money for all of you as brokers. So I think that's a good thing. But again, there's many possible negative implications as well. And one of those, I think, that goes, I don't think people talk about it enough, is that it can change the character of a neighborhood. And you know, a lot of people will say, oh, who cares? You know, housing is more important than the neighborhood. Well, for a lot of people, that's not the case. You know, they want to preserve where they live. They don't want every homeowner around them adding, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units. It totally changes the aspects of the neighborhood, which may be why they bought the property in the first place, right? And that's a bit of a tug of war battle in my mind, where, you know, character of a neighborhood is important, but so is housing. So I don't know how that's going to pan out. And if HOAs or cities are going to be able to stifle some of that effect based on that argument, right? Can a city or even a county argue that, hey, we don't want to allow 8 units or 6 units because this is historically a single family area and we don't want to disrupt that. There's value to that, right? It may make property prices go down because it could turn into this multifamily area where it's super crowded and congested and not really what people bargain for. Also, there's impacts on city services, things like water, garbage, utilities. That could all be strained if you add in all these extra units where they haven't planned for that or they're not prepared for that. So that could be very costly. And again, landlord tenant law considerations, things like, could you put yourself in the position where the tenants could now have rent control since you've added another unit? And I guess with the way the landlord tenant laws are written currently, I have the biggest concerns about that, because in some situations, you technically can't get a tenant out unless you have cause. And so if you don't have cause, you can get stuck with a tenant indefinitely, which I don't think anyone wants. Okay, here's the graphic. I'll let Kelly talk about this, as she mentioned that prior.
Yeah, so I did not create this. I found it online. So I just want to be clear, the source is over here on the side. I think it was from Santa Clara County, if my memory serves right. But anyways, what you can see if you go across the top row here, it says existing. So it's giving you different types of scenarios. So obviously right here, the first box, A1, it says a vacant lot. If we go over to B1, it's a lot with a single family home. C1, it's a single family home with an ADU, and then D1 is single family home with an ADU and a JDU. So if you go to the next row below, it's the duplex provision, not the lot split, and you can see what you can do with the existing scenario that you are presented with, whatever your client may have. And then if you go one row below again, this would be specific for the lot split. So I think it's just, I'm a visual learner myself, so I think seeing an example of what possible scenarios can be is helpful. And it just sort of, like I said, I think it can help visualize what is possible to do with whatever the scenario is that you have for, a single family residence that's on the property or with an ADU or JDU. So I think it just sort of gives a good, clarification as to what can be done.
Okay.
So I think next we'll talk about SB10. So SB10 was passed along with SB9. It's a sort of like sister bill, if you will. And it's a little bit different, but again, the main purpose of this is to, of course, address the housing crisis that, California is facing. So what it does essentially is just allow local governments to create housing opportunities by rezoning different areas. But what's key about this is that it's different than SB9 in that SB10 needs to be, it requires the local governments to take affirmative action to pass certain types of ordinance. So this is not automatic. Local governments will have to decide if they want to enact SB10. So whereas SB9 is statewide. So actually, could you go to the next slide?
Sure.
So SB10 is codified in Government Code Section 65913.5. If you're so inclined to read it, I'm sure it'll be incredibly enjoyable for everybody. But it like I said, authorizes the local government to rezone any parcel for up to 10 units per parcel, so long and at a specific height, whatever is specified within the city or county, so long as that parcel is located in a transit-rich area or an urban infill site. So a transit-rich area means a parcel that's a half a mile from major transit stops. So that would be buses, of course, BART, whatever train systems. And then an urban infill site is similar to this urban cluster, where the site is 75% of the perimeter is adjoined for urban use. So again, this would be more applicable for these urban areas rather than any sort of rural location. What's interesting and probably the most appealing about SB10 is that the local government's ordinance would not be subject to CEQA, and that's usually what holds up the process so long for getting any sort of development project approved, is that now you don't have to worry about years-long litigation or appeals process, because this local ordinance then would abolish any sort of need. And also another appealing part of this is that you can have up to 2 ADUs or JDUs, and that does not count towards your 10-unit limit. So you could have up to 12 units on a single parcel then. So can you go to the next slide, Ashley? So
okay,
it does. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. Sorry.
So jumping in here, what does SB10 exclude? And so one of the key things is that it does not apply to parcels in very high fire severity zones. And so I want to show you something really quick. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. And this website is great. I use this actually a lot for disclosures. And so if you have a property that's in one of these zones, you could type in the property address. I entered my firm's address here. But it's the fire hazard severity zones map with the state of California. And if you go to that and you search it, you can really search any property. It will show you. So there we are right there. And you zoom out, you'll see these zones and you'll see them highlighted in color. And so if you're in one of these red areas, which is, it's somewhat common in this area, not too bad. There's some more areas down here near Saratoga, then you would not be able to be within the requirements of SB10. So I think that if you're not sure, because most people don't know if they're in a fire severity zone, that's a pretty easy way to check. And so I just thought that was a useful tool for you all. Now let me go back to my slides. All right. So that's the tool there. I'll send these slides to Jody and she'll be able to send them to you as well. And so utilize that. And also on a separate note for disclosures, there's a fire or home hardening disclosure. And so you want to know for whatever property your clients are doing disclosures for, are they in that zone too? So I use that map for a bunch of different reasons. Also, does not apply to parcels in open space, park, or recreational lands approved by the voters. So that's important to know as well. And then a project may not be divided into small projects to avoid the limitations of SB 10. So while they've accounted for some loopholes, maybe not all of them, that's one of them that they have. So those are some of the exclusions. If it applies to the property, then you probably wouldn't be able to utilize SB 10. Next, local agency requirements under SB 10, there's a bunch of them, but each city or county must affirmatively pass an ordinance authorizing upzoning. And in adopting an ordinance, they must do several different things, and I listed them there for you for your learning. But the last one gives me the most concern. But first, it's declare that the zoning ordinance is pursuant to SB 10, clearly mark that the areas that are zoned for SB 10. And then this last one says make findings that increased density supports the adoption of the ordinance. Now, unlike with SB 9, where it's ministerial with their approval, this gives cities and counties a lot of discretion. And that's where I have concerns, is because if they have the ability to make an argument that the increased density does not support the ordinance, and they can just not pass it. So I think that's an issue if you're in an area where there's pressure from residents, or saying this is going to create issues for the neighborhood characteristics or the historic layout of the neighborhood, those types of things that could give rise to SB 10 not being available in a certain city or county. Again, once a local agency approves a zoning ordinance under SB 10, it cannot subsequently reduce the density of the parcel. So they can't pass it and then make you change what you've built later on. So if they revoke it subsequent to allowing you to utilize SB 10, that won't apply. It requires a 2/3 vote of the legislative body to have the ordinance supersede any zoning restrictions established by a local initiative. And this type of passing of an SB 10 ordinance in city or counties is limited up until January 1, 2029. And so hopefully by then there's some movement on that, but that's the general requirements locally for SB 10. All right, Kelly, back to you.
Yes. So what does SB 10 mean just overall and practically speaking? So in theory, it does increase the ability to create more housing opportunities with the upzoning without having to deal with CEQA approval. However, if the new housing, the actual housing itself, would require discretionary approval, and this would be, per the local government's individual, per the local government's. I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
Passing,
yeah. Thank you. Then it would still be, CEQA would still need to there would still need to be CEQA approval, for the specific actual housing. So for example, a subdivision map or a design review or something like that. So while the upzoning itself wouldn't be subject to CEQA, the housing still might be. So practically speaking, this really might not have any additional benefits at the end of the day. Right. So if you want to go to the next slide, Ashley. And this is, the pros and cons of SB 10 are similar to that of SB 9 in that, well, first of all, SB 10, this is specific to SB 10, that local governments now get to decide how to rezone areas for housing, but then that actually requires the local governments to affirmatively pass any ordinance. So it's not just inherent as a law statewide, it requires a 2/3 vote like Ashley was just describing. It provides more housing opportunity in transit-rich areas, but then that leads to overcrowding, more parking, loss of character, perhaps, if that's a concern. And while it can bring more opportunities in local areas for commercial and residential businesses, businesses and residences, it could also have an impact on city services, safety services, electrical, plumbing, things like that. So it you know, there are benefits and there are drawbacks to it too, but I think because it doesn't really change much at the end of the day, it doesn't have as large of an effect on the housing situations in California compared to SB9.
Great. So now I'm going to jump back to Jody and we can open it up for questions.
Okay. And as a reminder, everyone, we did record this and Ashley did say that she will send me her slides. I'm going to do a couple Zoom questions and then Mark, I see you have your hand up, so I will call on you in just a minute. So I'm starting from the top. Is it fair to say that generally a lot split will cost about $100,000 for non-civil engineering fees and civil engineering fees, even for architects and of course, construction?
I've seen that be the ballpark. Again, depends where you are. Certain counties and cities have it figured out better by now than others. I know, I forget which one. I think up in Glenn County, for some reason, their process was extremely expensive. But that seems about right. Although I don't know if Sherry is intending to ask, does that include legal fees and application fees? It sounds like it does. But yeah, I mean, it's an expensive endeavor for sure. But for specifics, Sherry, if you want to contact me offline, I can help you with that.
Can we split the lot and build another standalone single family house without having to live in it personally?
Yeah, so what they're saying that if you split the lot, you have to live in one of them, Christine. So you don't have to live in the new one. I mean, you can, but you would just have to live in one of the residential units. So if you live in one and you split the lot and you build another home in the subsequent lot, you don't have to live in that one, but you do have to live in one of them for 3 years after you do that.
Okay, Mark, if you want to ask your question, then I'll get back to Zoom.
Well, thank you, Jody. Always good to talk to you. Ashley, always
Hi.
a pleasure to talk to you. To the group out there, all these attendees, I want to tell you guys, first of all, this company, Simon and Adam and Ashley, the group, that is my choice, my recommendation for always any real estate attorney issues. They are the best. Thank you, guys. How was that for a pitch?
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thank you.
But now let's talk about a question for you. I live in an area of Montecito, which, and I'll be honest with you, we're a bunch of NIMBYs out here, and I'm proud of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We paid a premium. This is nothing to do, but we paid a premium to live in the NIMBY area. We don't want 8 homes, 10 homes, whatever. Is there? I know Woodside tried to pass thing and said that their property was their area was covered by the bobcats, or like that, mountain lion.
Yeah.
How effective is that, and what can we do to stop all this garbage from 9 and 10 happening in our area?
I mean, so you would have to have I mean, not that your basis is not logical, but you have to have a logical basis to where it'd be something that'd be justified to preserve the land. And so if you just don't want the type of clientele that it brings in with multifamily.
Not the clientele, it's the volume. You can't use the word clientele because that's discriminatory.
That
but
would be
we don't
right.
want the
That's what I was getting at. So if you didn't want the quote unquote type of people that would bring, that's not going to stand. Obviously, you can't discriminate against, it's familial discrimination. But if there's a justifiable cause on something, you could say, PG&E just can't serve that much more people. Yeah, that would be a challenge to it. You would have to have a justifiable basis and some data to support that. So if you are just speculating that, hey, I don't know about the water supply, then maybe look into that, right? But essentially what they're looking for is some kind of data to look at that would be, that would hold up in theory in court if you had to get there. How
has there been any
challenges pan
cases?
out? Huh?
Actually, has there been any cases besides Woodside? And
It's
have
so
any of them-
new. There's one down in LA. I'm blanking.
They just
on.
talked about, I'll be honest with you. I feel like at Ledge Day, it was actually talked about that CAR is going after specific towns. Huntington Beach was one.
Yeah.
And they're going to these cities and trying to talk to them and trying to work it out. And any city that is, using bobcats or any other basis for not allowing these things, CAR is filing lawsuits against them.
What, CR's fighting them?
Yes.
My CAR?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a whole nother, I want to stick
Okay,
to
we'll get, well,
SB9 and
right,
10
it's a different
and-
thing. I'll talk to you later about that.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
how we
I'm
can
mad
make it work. for
I'm much
clients.
madder now, but either way, listen, I don't want to take up all the time.
Sure.
But I want to thank you always. I want to see you back at the mastermind soon.
Yep.
And welcome aboard, Kelly. I didn't
Thank you.
say hi to Simon. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Okay, can you clarify what mods can be done to an existing primary residence, not the rental, to allow for a lot split? For example, if it is a standard track home, which has not been a rental, can it be demolished in order to make it 60-40 split and rebuild 2 structures?
So, Carl, it's an interesting question, and I see where, or why you would ask that, but essentially the way that I interpret the law, and I'll let Kelly chime in as well, is that it's not a matter of whether or not it's been used as a rental, it's a matter of whether it's under the protections of the rental laws. And so if you're in an area where if you did have a tenant, they would be subject to rent control protections or just cause protections, which is nearly everywhere. The answer is probably no, you cannot completely demolish the unit. Now, I've read some things that say you can do a partial, but let me see. So you want to demolish the freestanding home to build 2 separate units. I presume you want to build, a residential unit, not an ADU. I would have to clarify, Carl, with you whether or not that property is subject to rental protections, but it's not a matter of if you did, it's a matter of if you would be subject to those protections.
Yeah, just to jump in, and I agree with Ashley that it's not whether they're, if a tenant is in there, it's one thing, of course, but if it's whether or not that lot would be subject, where the lot exists, if that would be subject to rent control laws, then you cannot demolish it.
Correct.
Okay. Can you explain what, and you may have kind of touched on this, but can you explain what GC 69413 means by adopting state fire mitigation measures? This is needed if a property is in a very high fired hazard area.
So that I want to say, Kelly's probably looking up the code section.
I am.
She's the queen at that, but that's where that exemption to SB10 came in, where if you're in one of those areas, they're not going to let you add in, 8-9 units or put in 10 units because it's such a high risk area. But again, that map provides you which areas are subject to that. But what they're saying is that they are taking that into consideration, that if you're in a high fire area, it's not just free building, they're going to take that into consideration. But Kelly, did you find that ordinance?
No, Dawn, can you send me the government code section again? Because that government code section doesn't exist from what I can tell on Google. So could you send what you were?
It was 69413.
Yeah, but when
0.4.
I'm looking it up, it's not coming up as a code section. So I could maybe revisit this or just email Dawn separately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you clarify, can we build a duplex without splitting the lot and not having to live in either one of the units?
Yeah, so this has come up a couple times, but essentially what they're saying is that you only have to provide an affidavit of a 3-year planned residency if you're splitting the lot. And so if you have a unit on a property where you have tenants and you wanted to add an additional unit or convert that to a duplex, that would be okay. You don't have to have residency there.
Joseph said that he split his lot and it was less than $100,000.
Okay.
For reference. Question, once we know what we can do with our lot and the lot split, you've gone through your checklist, what are the best next steps to take? Should you contact a civil engineer, then building architects? Who knows? Does anybody know how to get this going?
Yeah, so we were just talking about this before we were getting ready to present. But this is, it's kind of like everything has to be going at once. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So you need to look up the local city or county application process. A lot of places have provided forms where you can fill them out and submit them, but it's an issue. So if you're submitting a form to split your lot, you don't necessarily want to jump the gun on that. You want to talk to an architect, you want to talk to a contractor, you want to talk to the building department. What I would suggest, Sherry, is that you make sure that whatever you can build, number one, is feasible. So you want to make sure that you're going to be able to afford, the contractors, the timeline, how long is it going to take? Are you going to be able to build whatever you desire to do? And then simultaneously be in the process of applying for the lot split or even the duplex provision. What I don't, and going back to that, exactly what I don't want to happen is I don't want you to go and submit a lot split application and then you have 2 lots and then you're like, oh crap, I didn't realize how much it costs to build a home, or I can't wait that long, this isn't feasible. And then now you have an issue of potentially you would have to try and merge the lots back together if you didn't want to build. But who knows how to get this going. I'll put in everyone. So I'll put our emails in there. If you want to reach out, we can get you linked up with the right people to get this started. If that's something you're interested in, we've done a couple of applications as a firm with different cities or counties. It just depends on how extensive the project is. But I can help you with that, Sherry, no problem.
So I don't see any more questions and nobody has their hands up. So I have a question because you brought up something interesting. My background is interesting, and one of the things that I worked in with in a previous life was water, and specifically the lack of it. And this was about probably 6 years ago, so it's even worse now. And one of the symposiums that I helped put on was water districts working with land managers. And land management. And it makes me wonder, with the drought that we have going on right now, and you guys may be not able to not answer this, but with the drought, and then you're building more homes, and I know that we're building high rises and stuff. Could that be a reason that a city doesn't allow for these things? Because you mentioned PG&E, so I'm wondering if the water issue is something as well, specifically South County, when you get into wells and things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, if somewhere like Palm Springs or some of these areas where it's desert area, or maybe areas where they have to get water transferred in. I know you may know about that, Jody, right? So if they're outsourcing, or they're not outsourcing, they're importing their water supply. There's probably a very specific budget and supply that they are able to retain. Yeah, that could be an issue. I guess it would depend on the area, but if my concern with challenging it on that basis is that you would need data on that, right? So my understanding of the successful challenges that are ongoing, and I know CAR is doing some of those, is that you have to have evidence. So it can't be speculative concern. It can't just be like, oh, well, would that affect the cell service? And it can't be a question. It would be something that people would have to actually run hard numbers on and actually determine, would this actually put strain on? It can't just be speculation. And I think the reason for that is that, going back to what Mark said, you probably have a lot of people that it's more of a NIMBY concern than it is the actual utility concern, and they're just using that as a basis. So they're going to want to see some kind of support or data that would justify limiting additional housing.
That makes sense. I just thought I'd ask, because that's a big issue right now with water.
Oh yeah,
so.
for sure.
Yeah. Does anybody else have questions before we wrap up? Okay.
Right.
Actually, Pat, did you, Pat, go ahead.
Hi, Pat.
Hi. Yeah, I took my suit and tie off, so I can't be. I just want to plug the Brewer Law Firm. Super wonderful. And their the logo is not soup to nuts, but what's the logo?
Yeah, it's a real estate from the ground up. So everything from like Jody's talking about to the air, view easements, things like that. We do everything in real estate.
Yeah, what's great about that, you all have your specialties,
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Well done. Hope to see you again real soon.
Thank you so much, Pat.
Thank you.
We did get another question is, can someone submit the application by the split application by themselves? Or do they have to hire a civil engineer or architect to do it for them?
My understanding is you don't have to be licensed to submit the application. If anything, I think the owner might actually have to sign for most of it, especially any affidavit of residency. Anytime you were to start to get into permit pulling or any kind of plan submission, yeah, you would need people that are licensed in that area. But the application itself, no. Although it's practically speaking, it may be better for the engineer to do it or the architect to do it, since having them involved from the get-go is probably the best. As I mentioned before, the issues about, you don't want to go and split your lot as the owner and then talk to the experts, the engineers or architects, and say, this is what I want to do. And they tell you like, okay, it's going to cost this much and it's outside your budget or your timeline or anything like that. So could you do it? Technically, yes, but should you? Probably not. I think just as a practical matter, I think that you could run into issues by just, it's like the chicken before the egg type deal, right? So I don't want to have you having issues with splitting the lot before you're prepared to do it.
Awesome. Okay. And once again, we did record this. So yes, I will get this out to everybody either later this week